Tonight we will begin with a development that NATO's top officials have long worried about and even publicly downplayed and ultimately refused to confront. This development occurred not during weeks of deteriorating diplomatic relations, but within the time frame of a single televised statement from the Kremlin. I'm talking about 30 minutes that echoed across every European capital, 30 minutes that triggered emergency alerts and meetings at NATO headquarters in Brussels. What Vladimir Putin did today completely breached a boundary that American and European leadership believed would remain intact. And when that boundary was broken, NATO reacted instantly. They acted with a degree of cohesion, speed, and coordination rarely seen in the alliance's modern history. Phones began ringing in Washington before Putin's speech was even finished. Secure communication channels across the Atlantic were simultaneously activated. European foreign ministers were summoned from dinners and family gatherings. Defense ministers interrupted planned briefings to hold emergency sessions. This wasn't the routine crisis management that NATO regularly conducts. This was something fundamentally different. But what official statements don't convey is this. The 30-day period announced by Putin isn't actually about the demands he stated. It's about what he's investigating. And if NATO can't overcome this challenge, the military alliance that triumphed in the Cold War may not survive the next month. It's not hard to see that, actually. Let me explain what's really going on here. Let's consider this. For the past 18 months, there have been signs, not through official diplomatic correspondence, not through official channels, that the Kremlin was planning something unprecedented. Everyone could see it. Putin certainly displayed aggression, but his aggression was methodical. His maneuvers adhered to a certain logic, a consistent rhythm, an almost predictable sequence. Western intelligence agencies were familiar with interpreting his operational pattern. Military exercises heralding invasion, propaganda offensives, shaping domestic public opinion, diplomatic justifications, providing international protection. But what caused urgent concern in Washington and Brussels this week was the sudden halt of this familiar pattern. Intelligence analysts who constantly monitor Russian state-controlled media understand the warning signs. Synchronized messages distributed on RT, TASS, and Sputnik. A sudden insurance in military-focused broadcasts. Scripted narratives from Kremlin representatives. The rapid elimination of dissenting viewpoints from public platforms. All these indicators have been shrouded in darkness. Within intelligence circles, however, whenever the Kremlin apparatus falls silent, it is invariably preceded by a much more dramatic event. What followed surpassed even the most pessimistic scenarios previously simulated by NATO strategic planners. Early Monday morning, European intelligence networks detected highly erratic encrypted communication traffic between Moscow and Russian military installations across the Western Military District, including activation sequences not transmitted for over 30 years. These represent protocol categories that Russia only uses when signaling something very specific. Let me put it this way. Impending military operations, strategic force repositioning, or a fundamental shift in its strategic posture toward Western countries. The communications were detected by signal intelligence stations operating across Northern Europe. Analysts in Germany, Poland, and the United Kingdom simultaneously flagged the anomalous traffic pattern. Within minutes, the information was shared through NATO's integrated intelligence network. Senior officials were briefed within an hour. NATO intelligence analysts struggled immediately to determine which category this communication pattern belonged to, or whether it encompassed all three scenarios simultaneously. But what they understood for sure was that Putin had fundamentally changed Russia's strategic orientation. When a nuclear-armed adversary changes its strategic stance without explanation, even through gradual adjustments, all intelligence services around the world intensify their surveillance activities. The question wasn't whether something would happen, but in what form it would happen. Then the broadcast took place. Precisely at 8 o'clock Moscow time, Putin appeared on state-controlled television. There was no prior notification, no diplomatic preparation. It was simply a direct communication to the Russian people and, consequently, to the international community. His terms were very clear and harsh. First, NATO must eliminate all military infrastructure deployed in member countries after 9. This includes Poland, the Baltic republics, Romania, Bulgaria, and virtually every country that joined the alliance after the end of the Cold War. Second, NATO must provide legally enforceable guarantees that Ukraine and Georgia will be permanently expelled from the alliance. Third, all NATO military exercises conducted within 300 kilometers of Russia's territorial borders must cease immediately. What actually forced European authorities to resort to encrypted communication devices was this. Putin set a 1-month response period. 1 month. It wasn't presented as a negotiating framework or structured as an opening diplomatic position, but delivered as an ultimatum. The warning statement released by the White House this evening was not procedural. This is unusual. It wasn't merely symbolic. It conveyed a real sense of urgency. Official sources and briefings characterized Putin's action as destabilizing and precedented in the post-Cold War geopolitical landscape. And perhaps most importantly, a direct challenge to the fundamental principles of European continental security. The Kremlin's strategic calculation was highly transparent. The demands were so extreme that they would expose rifts within NATO, force member states to choose between direct conflict and diplomatic compromise, and systematically explore structural weaknesses. But this strategic approach only works effectively if the targeted entity shows hesitation. NATO showed no hesitation. In fact, their response today was among the swiftest and most unified since the alliance's founding. Current intelligence confirms this. Within 4 hours of Putin's televised address, the NATO Secretary General convened an emergency session of the North Atlantic Council. These were not standard consultation procedures. These were Article 4 consultations, the formal procedural mechanism member states resort to when they perceive their territorial integrity, political independence, or fundamental security to be threatened. Throughout NATO's entire organizational history, Article 4 has been formally invoked only 7 times, but as of today, it has been invoked for the 8th time. Tonight, the Pentagon confirmed that the U.S. has begun repositioning military assets across Eastern Europe. This includes the deployment of additional fighter jet squadrons to Poland and Romania, which are only planned to be activated under major strategic escalation scenarios. The repositioning operations were not long in coming, beginning just before Putin finished his televised address. In fact, this timing conveys everything necessary to show how seriously Washington is taking this threat. While diplomatic correspondence was still being prepared, military transport aircraft were moving personnel and equipment eastward. The command centers at EUCOM headquarters in Stuttgart went on high alert. Strategic planners activated contingency plans that had been developed over months but were not fully activated until tonight. They strengthened the existing Baltic air policing mission with additional aircraft and personnel. They activated additional naval allies in the North Atlantic region. They accelerated the delivery schedule for air defense systems previously promised to frontline member states, but not yet physically delivered. Shipments planned for next month are being loaded onto cargo planes for urgent delivery. From an operational standpoint, the U.S. identified and addressed weaknesses in NATO's eastern defense line. Weapons that would be systematically exploited if Russia made the first military move. Isn't this operational response what made the tone of the White House's warning so urgent? Putin's ultimatum wasn't just rhetoric. It came with tangible, observable military repositioning. Satellite imagery later analyzed by Western intelligence agencies documented additional battalion tactical groups advancing toward the territorial borders of Estonia and Latvia. A significant increase in naval activity was observed in the Baltic Sea region. Airbase facilities in Kaliningrad, which had been operationally inactive for months, were reactivated. The movement of tactical nuclear-capable delivery systems to forward-deployed positions was recorded. This represented a category of strategic posture that, if allowed to advance unimpeded, could transition from a threatening deployment to operational readiness within a few days. As intelligence reports continued to arrive in the evening, additional details emerged regarding the broad scale of NATO's coordinated response. The United Kingdom announced it was accelerating its existing military support package to Poland, now including advanced air defense systems and significantly increased troop rotation program. Germany Consistently criticized for its perceived hesitation in previous crisis situations, officially confirmed the deployment of additional Bundeswehr troops to Lithuania under the framework of its established Advanced Forward Asset Battle Group. France activated designated elements of its Rapid Reaction Force and placed them on high operational alert. Canada stated it would significantly expand its current military training mission in Latvia, deploying additional personnel and transferring equipment. This wasn't just a diplomatic stance designed for media consumption, nor was it just carefully crafted official statements. This was a real and hard military mobilization. This was the doctrine of collective defense applied in real operational conditions. And collective defense represents the only strategic element that Putin has consistently tried to dismantle since the start of his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Against every pressure campaign he systematically pursued, NATO effectively responded with answers that strengthened rather than weakened the structural integrity of the alliance. The economic war that Putin expected to divide Europe united. This economic chaos produced an outcome Putin didn't anticipate. The energy blackmail that was supposed to force submission accelerated Europe's energy independence. The military threats designed to intimidate led to the largest increases in defense spending in a generation. Huge sums of money began to be spent on defense. What makes this moment so dangerous and significant is that Putin's ultimatum comes at a time when he is under increasing pressure from multiple directions. Russian military bloggers want faster, more aggressive action in Ukraine. They are impatient for it. Economic elites want sanctions lifted and access to frozen assets. Nationalist hardliners want escalation, including the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons. Pragmatists within the system want a way out that allows Russia to declare victory without paying a higher price. All these competing groups demand action, results, and their patience with Putin's handling of the situation is wearing thin. Putin is trying to balance these demands while leading a military operation that has cost hundreds of thousands and achieved none of its real objectives. The promised three-day operation has stretched on for years. The expected collapse of the Ukrainian resistance never happened. The expected disintegration of Western support never occurred. And when leaders in this position make sudden moves, they don't do it out of strength. They do it out of pressure. They do it out of vulnerability. It's a matter of cause and effect. They do it because they need to show their domestic audience that the situation is still under control. Do you think they are able to achieve this? NATO's official communiqué, distributed to member governments and made public, was designed to demonstrate the alliance's unwillingness to negotiate under threat. Officials explicitly stated that Putin's demands were inconsistent with the fundamental principles of European security and the sovereign right of nations to choose their own alliances. In diplomatic language, this means no, not let's discuss this, not we understand your concerns, but simply no. You don't usually hear this tone from NATO unless something serious is at stake. The communiqué stated any military action against a NATO member state will be met with a collective response. Article 5 remains the cornerstone of our alliance, and our commitment to it is absolute. Article 5 states that an attack on one is an attack on all. These are the words that have prevented conflict between great powers in Europe for 75 years. Tonight, these are stated not as a historical principle, but as a present reality. Meanwhile, the NATO Secretary General delivered a direct and uncompromising speech to the North Atlantic Council tonight. We will not be intimidated, he said. We will not be divided, and we will not compromise the security of our member state. Russia's demands cannot be considered a basis for negotiation. These are an attempt to return to an era when great powers dictated terms to smaller nations and forced them to submit. That era is over. The era of the big fish eats the small fish is over. Here's what makes the situation even more worrying. Putin's ultimatum wasn't alone. Along with the 30-day deadline, Belarus announced it would conduct joint military exercises with Russia and deploy tactical missiles near its border with Poland. Russian naval vessels entered the English Channel in a move described by the Royal Navy as a show of force. In the 2 days preceding Putin's speech, cyber attacks targeting government systems in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania increased by 400%. Russian state media began airing programs about NATO aggression, nuclear readiness, and the righteousness of Russia's cause. All of this happened within the same 3-day period. When Putin moves multiple pieces simultaneously, it means something bigger is on the way. This isn't a lone provocation. It could also be described as a campaign, a coordinated campaign. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One possibility is that Putin is preparing a limited military operation against one of the Baltic states, testing whether NATO will actually invoke Article 5 for a small ally. Another possibility is that Putin is trying to create conditions for negotiations by using the ultimatum as leverage to extract concessions on Ukraine. The third possibility, which most worries officials, is that Putin is trying to break up the alliance by forcing member states to choose between war and compromise. But today, NATO has removed that card from the table. They didn't act hesitantly. They didn't give evasive answers. They didn't make carefully crafted statements that would leave room for strategic retreat. They responded clearly and unequivocally. The alliance continued. What we are witnessing now is a test of collective will. Putin wants to see if NATO will crumble under pressure, if decades of alliance-building efforts will be broken by a single ultimatum. He wants to know if the promises made to the Baltic states when they joined NATO were real or merely symbolic. That's why he's testing them with pressure. He wants to test whether the Americans will actually risk conflict for countries that couldn't even be found on a map before this crisis began. NATO wants to show that collective defense is not just a phrase in a treaty. It is a reality backed by military strength and political commitment. It is a serious necessity that transcends political cycles and economic calculations. Washington wants to avoid any miscalculation that could lead to a direct confrontation between nuclear powers, and Moscow wants to reshape European security without having to fight for it. The next month will determine which view prevails. Tonight, we received information from defense officials who are monitoring Russian military movements in real time using all available intelligence gathering capability. They say there has been an increase in troop concentration near the Baltic border, but not yet to levels that would indicate imminent preparation for an offensive. The observed formations are consistent with either defensive positions or preparations for potential offensive operations, making it difficult to assess Putin's immediate intention. They say the Russian naval forces are positioned in a manner consistent with either training activity or preparation for blockade operations. And they say Putin's decision to issue a public ultimatum is part of a broader psychological campaign aimed at creating fear and division within NATO. The hope in Moscow seems to be that public pressure will achieve what military pressure has failed to do, forcing NATO members to reconsider their commitment to collective defense when faced with the possibility of a real conflict. But NATO is not backing down, on the contrary. We could say NATO is moving forward. The unified, swift, and militarily backed response they delivered today sent a message to Putin that the alliance will not bow to bullying. And it sent a message to the world that collective defense remains the strongest force in international security. As the month-long countdown continues, we await the emergence of more details on exactly what Putin hoped to achieve with this ultimatum. But what we know is that NATO's response was timely. It prevented Putin from exploiting divisions. It reassured the states on the front lines that they would not be abandoned. And it showed the world that the alliance forged after World War II is capable of dealing with the threats of the 21st century. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the coming weeks. If he backs down, this moment will be remembered as an ultimatum that strengthened NATO rather than shattered it. If he escalates, NATO has already shown that it is prepared. They have shown that they are united. They have shown that they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in years, the Kremlin seems to be rethinking. Moscow is silent, very silent. And when Putin is silent, it means he's calculating. It means he's carefully choosing his next move. Because tonight, Putin learned something he should have understood a long time ago. NATO is not an alliance on paper. NATO will not be broken by ultimatums. And NATO will defend every inch of Allied territory. This story is not over yet. The clock is ticking. 29 days left. But tonight, one thing is very clear, right before our eyes. The alliance continues. The commitment is real, and the 30-day ultimatum may have made NATO stronger than ever. Stay tuned to stay informed about the news.